The year is 170 AD. The frozen Danube, once Rome's shield, becomes its greatest peril. Barbarian hordes storm across the ice, torching cities, slaughtering legions, and bringing terror closer to Rome's heart than ever before. Italy trembles, Aquileia lies in ashes, and whispers spread. Has the eternal empire met its end? Yet in the midst of despair, a lone figure rises, not just a ruler but a philosopher forced to trade scrolls for the sword. His name, Marcus Aurelius. Stay with us as we uncover how Rome's philosopher-king faced the storm on the Danube, turning despair into defiance. This is the tale of survival, strategy, and spirit. If you seek history's greatest lessons, make sure to watch till the very end. In the winter of 170 AD, the northern frontier of the Roman Empire cracked beneath a storm no one had foreseen. The Danube River, that cold, restless boundary, had long served as Rome's shield against the restless tribes beyond. But this year, nature betrayed the empire. A savage frost descended across Europe, freezing the river solid. What had once been a barrier of water became a gleaming highway of ice, and across it thundered the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and their fierce allies. The legions stationed along the frontier were thin, worn by years of skirmishing and sickness. They were no match for the avalanche of warriors that surged southward. Villages in Pannonia went up in flames, their people either butchered or dragged away into slavery. Roman watchtowers, proud symbols of authority, were toppled like children's toys beneath the axes of the invaders. Smoke choked the sky as columns of refugees stumbled westward, their eyes haunted, their voices hollow with terror. Then came the news that struck like a thunderbolt. Aquileia, the jewel of the north and the gateway to Italy itself, had fallen. The invaders stormed its walls with a ferocity unseen in centuries. Temples were looted, villas burned, and the streets ran red. Aquileia's destruction sent shockwaves through the empire. Never since the days of Hannibal had the Italian heartland been so directly threatened. Rome's citizens, long sheltered by their empire's iron borders, now felt the icy breath of fear on their necks. Panic spread through the capital like wildfire. Rumors whispered that the barbarian horde was marching straight for Rome itself, that soon the Colosseum and the Forum would share Aquileia's fate. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Senators, once proud and defiant, murmured of evacuation. The Eternal City had always prided itself as untouchable, safeguarded by the gods and the legions. But now, with the smoke of Aquileia visible on the northern horizon, that illusion cracked. Nor was the empire in any condition to mount a swift response. The Antonine Plague, a relentless pestilence carried by soldiers returning from the east, had drained the life from Rome for over a decade. Entire towns were emptied of men. Families vanished from the census rolls. Legions marched with ranks half filled by boys and old men. Coffins piled high in city streets, and funeral pyres burned without pause. Economies crumbled as fields went untilled, and workshops silent. To this broken empire came the barbarians. Their timing was cruel perfection. They poured across the frontier not as raiders seeking plunder, but as conquerors seeking land. Behind them, entire tribes pressed forward. Women, children, wagons, animals, intent not only on pillage but on settlement. They meant to carve their future from Rome's flesh. In the countryside of northern Italy, farmsteads were abandoned overnight. Families packed what few belongings they could and fled south, leaving behind orchards heavy with fruit and fields ripe with grain. The invaders harvested the bounty as they marched, their bonfires blazing against the night sky. The Roman generals on the frontier faltered. With their legions weakened by plague and stretched across too many provinces, they hesitated, squabbled, or retreated. Some attempted to make a stand only to be overwhelmed, their eagle standards lost in the snow. For the first time in living memory, it seemed the Danube frontier, the iron wall of Rome, had dissolved. In the Senate, debate turned to despair. Could the empire survive another Hannibal? Would the Tiber soon mirror the Danube, choked with corpses and wreckage? Even the gods seemed silent, as if turning their faces away from Rome's suffering. The tragedy was not only military but spiritual. For centuries, Romans had believed themselves masters of the world, heirs to an eternal order ordained by destiny. But as refugees flooded into Italy, bearing tales of slaughter and fire, that belief eroded. If Aquileia could fall, what city was safe? If the Danube could freeze, what frontier was secure? Thus, by the dawn of spring in 170, the empire stood at its lowest point. The northern sky glowed with the embers of Aquileia. Panic and plague hollowed the capital, and in the frozen forest beyond the Danube, the barbarian storm gathered strength for yet another blow. Rome had endured calamities before, yet never had its borders been so breached, its people so shaken, its destiny so uncertain. The eternal empire now teetered on the edge of a chasm, staring into a darkness from which it might never return. While Rome trembled, all eyes turned to the man who bore the empire's crown. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, known to history as the philosopher-emperor, had never sought war, nor reveled in conquest. He was a scholar, a seeker of wisdom, a student of Stoic philosophy who had once dreamed of a reign marked by peace and learning. Yet fate, ever cruel to dreamers, had bound him to an empire aflame. For years, Marcus had endured trials that would have broken lesser rulers. The Antonine plague raged through his dominions, claiming the lives of his people, his soldiers, even those within his household. Rebellion simmered on the eastern frontier. The treasury lay hollowed, the legions bled dry, and now the Marcomanni stormed across the Danube with fire and fury. In this hour of despair, Marcus Aurelius revealed not only the steel of a soldier, but the depth of a philosopher. He did not flee to the safety of Rome's palaces, nor abandon the frontiers to faltering generals. Instead, he roused himself from sickness, donned the cloak of command, and marched northward to share the hardship of his men. His pen would not be set aside, but rather carried into camp alongside sword and shield. Contemporaries record how the emperor transformed the imperial tent into both council chamber and school. By day, he studied maps, convened with commanders, and dispatched orders across the provinces. By night, under flickering lamplight, he returned to his meditations, writing in the quiet of his soul reflections that would outlast the smoke of war. It was here, amidst the clamor of camps and the cries of wounded men, that he wrote the words later gathered into his immortal meditations. But Marcus Aurelius was more than a thinker in armor. He was a father, not only to his son Commodus, but to the empire itself. The Romans looked upon him as pater patriae, the father of their country. And like any father, he felt the anguish of a family in peril. His eyes, often described as bright yet shadowed with sorrow, saw the suffering of his soldiers as his own. He ate their bread, shared their cold, endured their marches. In him they found not a distant monarch, but a comrade. Still, the challenge was monumental. Marcus commanded not seasoned legions at full strength, but ranks thinned by plague and desertion. The Aquileia, the sacred eagles of the legions, had been lost in skirmishes, shattering morale. He needed men, and he found them wherever he could. Slaves were promised freedom if they bore arms for Rome. Gladiators traded the arena for the battlefield. Criminals were pardoned on condition they marched to the front. For Marcus, the preservation of Rome was worth every desperate measure. His enemies scoffed at this patchwork army. Yet in the emperor's presence, raw recruits found discipline, and discipline bred resilience. He drilled them with patience, trained them with severity, and instilled in them a conviction that they fought not merely for coin or survival, but for the very essence of civilization. Against the wild forests of Germania, Marcus set the stone of Roman order. Against the chaos of invasion, he raised the shield of endurance. Witnesses tell of a man who never lost composure, even when surrounded by catastrophe. When Aquileia's ashes were still smoldering, Marcus did not wail or curse the gods. Instead, he spoke calmly to his generals. The obstacle is the way. To him, every disaster was also a teacher, every loss a chance to learn endurance. He could not command fortune, but he could command himself, and by his example, he commanded Rome. The emperor's presence on the frontier became a beacon. Refugees who had lost everything saw in him a promise that Rome had not abandoned them. Soldiers hardened by despair found new courage. Even senators who had once whispered doubts began to rally behind the philosopher in armor. Slowly, through sheer force of will, Marcus Aurelius transformed fear into resolve. Yet his struggle was not only with the barbarians. Shadows lurked within Rome itself. Certain generals, scenting weakness, conspired to seize power. In the east, rivals dreamed of donning the purple in his stead. Marcus knew that the sword at his throat came not only from beyond the Danube, but also from within his own empire. And still he bore the burden without bitterness. Men are not disturbed by things, he wrote in his tent, but by the view they take of them. For Marcus Aurelius, the Marcomannic invasion was not merely a war of armies, but a war of the spirit. If Rome's people surrendered to fear, the empire was lost. If they held fast, if they could endure, as he endured, then no barbarian storm could extinguish the eternal flame. His greatness lay not in any single triumph, nor in glorious charges across the battlefield, but in his unyielding constancy. He stood as Rome's anchor when the seas rose high. Where another ruler might have sunk into despair or cruelty, Marcus Aurelius sought clarity, justice, and courage. He proved that philosophy was not weakness but strength, that the calm of the mind could be as mighty as the edge of a sword. By the spring of 171, as the empire began to gather itself for counterattack, Rome looked upon its emperor with renewed faith. Here was no Caesar drunk on ambition, no Nero lost in vanity. Here was a man who carried both scroll and spear, wisdom and will. Here was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who had become a warrior, not by choice but by necessity, and who, in so doing, became the very embodiment of Rome's indomitable spirit. Though Marcus Aurelius stood resolute on the northern frontier, the empire behind him shuddered like a wounded beast. Rome's heart was no longer the unshakable citadel of old. Beneath the marble and triumphal arches, the eternal city groaned with fear, sickness, and unrest. The Antonine Plague, cruelest of Rome's afflictions, still haunted every street and province. Carried back from the east by soldiers of Lucius Verus years earlier, it had not abated but lingered like a vengeful shadow. Entire villages lay abandoned, their fields untended, their houses collapsing in silence. In the capital, smoke from endless funeral pyres drifted into the sky, a daily reminder of mortality. Children perished before reaching manhood. Magistrates fell in office. Priests muttered prayers to deaf gods. The very rhythm of Roman life faltered. As markets thinned and laborers dwindled, the plague gnawed at the empire's sinews, its economy. With fewer hands to till the soil, harvests shrank. Grain shipments from Egypt, once the lifeblood of the Roman populace, arrived later spoiled, feeding riots in the capital. Merchants closed their shops, artisans abandoned their trades. Coins were clipped, silver diluted, and the weight of inflation pressed hard upon both rich and poor. Even senators whispered of bankruptcy, and always beyond the empire's frontiers, enemies watched with hungry eyes. The Parthians in the east, the restless tribes in Britannia, the Berbers in Africa, all gauged the empire's weakness. Each province feared it might be the next to bleed. Yet the emperor, bound to the Danube, could not be everywhere. Rome was vast, too vast even for the iron will of one man. Worse still was the poison of treachery. As Marcus labored in the frozen north, voices in the Senate whispered of his mortality. What if the emperor falls, they asked. What if the philosopher dies in some dark forest of Germania? Ambition, ever Rome's most faithful parasite, stirred in the hearts of generals and governors. Some saw the empire's peril as opportunity. Indeed, conspiracies sprouted like weeds. In the east, Avidius Cassius, one of Rome's most capable commanders, believed false rumors of Marcus's death and declared himself emperor. For 3 months, Syria and Egypt rallied to his standard. Though the rebellion collapsed before it reached Italy, the wound was deep. It showed that loyalty to the philosopher-king was not absolute. Even in Rome's darkest hour, men coveted the purple. Meanwhile, in the army camps, discontent simmered. Veterans, weary of endless marches, longed for their homes. Recruits pressed from the dregs of society grumbled at harsh discipline. Plague stalked the tents, felling comrades as swiftly as any German blade. The legions, once Rome's pride, were shadows of their former selves. Ghost armies, half-starved and half-sick, fighting not only enemies without but despair within. The empire's spiritual foundations, too, began to crack. The old gods of Rome, Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, seemed to have abandoned their people. Sacrifices yielded no relief, omens no comfort. Into this vacuum crept new cults and religions, offering salvation beyond Rome's traditions. Among them, Christianity spread quietly, whispering of a kingdom not of this world. To many Romans weary of plague and war, such words held dangerous appeal. To others, they signaled a betrayal of the old order. Thus, faith itself became divided, just as the empire's armies and politics splintered. For Marcus Aurelius, the weight was crushing. He knew that every decision on the Danube rippled across the empire. If he faltered, governors might rebel, provinces might secede, the fragile economy might collapse. Rome teetered like a colossus upon shaking legs. One push, one great defeat, could send it crashing into ruin. The very geography of Rome's power exposed its fragility. Roads once kept armies swift now carried plague and rebellion as fast as reinforcements. Vast distances that had once symbolized Rome's grandeur now revealed her vulnerability. To defend the Danube meant leaving Africa bare. To strengthen Syria meant weakening Gaul. Everywhere Rome was stretched thin. And yet, amidst this turmoil, there was something uncanny in the endurance of the empire itself. The Senate still met, cloaked in tradition. The aqueducts still carried water into the capital. The amphitheaters still rang with cheers, even if fewer came to watch. Rome, even wounded, was immense, a giant that staggered but did not fall. Still, the question haunted every Roman. Was this the twilight? Had the age of empire reached its end? Or could the philosopher-emperor, alone against storm and sickness, somehow guide his people back from the brink? The empire was riven by contradictions, mighty yet fragile, ancient yet vulnerable, rich yet hollowed. It was a realm at once eternal and imperiled. And Marcus Aurelius, though he bore the weight of command, knew he could not carry Rome's burden forever. Shadows lengthened across the frontiers, conspiracies whispered in the Senate, and the plague claimed another 1,000 souls with each passing week. Rome, for all its power, now stood like a candle flickering in the wind. One gust more, and it might be snuffed out. The storm that battered Rome had a face, and it was not the faceless tide of nameless barbarians that Roman writers so often described. It had leaders, it had cunning, and above all, it had purpose. The Marcomanni and their allies were no mere raiding parties seeking loot. They were a people in motion, a nation of tribes determined to break the wall of Rome and carve out a place for themselves beneath the Mediterranean sun. At the heart of this great migration stood the Marcomanni, a powerful Germanic confederation whose roots stretched deep into the forests of Bohemia. Their leader, Balamar, was no ordinary chieftain. Unlike the reckless warlords who often squandered their warriors in fruitless charges, Balamar was a strategist, a visionary who understood both his own people and the weaknesses of Rome. He forged alliances where others would have feuded, uniting the Quadi, the Sarmatians, the Vandals, and countless smaller tribes into a single storm. To his followers, he was not only a king, but a prophet of change, a man who promised fertile fields and secure homes if they pressed southward into Rome's lands. Balamar had watched Rome for years. He knew of the plague that hollowed its legions, of the discontent simmering in its provinces, of the emperor stretched thin across a vast and fragile empire. He understood that Rome's strength lay in its discipline and organization, but also that discipline faltered when armies marched hungry and disease-stricken. He grasped what many barbarians never had, that Rome's power was not invincible. The Marcomannic onslaught was therefore not a blind eruption, but a calculated strike. When the Danube froze, Balamar saw opportunity where others saw only weather. He sent his warriors across the ice, a maneuver so audacious that it shocked the Roman frontier into paralysis. Town after town fell before the legions could rally. When Aquileia burned, it was Balamar's banner that flew above the ruins. What made these enemies terrifying was not only their ferocity, but their adaptability. Roman armies were trained to fight in the open field, to deploy in ordered ranks where discipline and armor prevailed. But the tribes fought differently. They struck from forests, melted into swamps, ambushed supply lines, and vanished before the legions could counter. Their warriors, hardened by winters in the northern wilds, bore long spears, heavy axes, and oval shields painted with snarling beasts. They wore little armor, relying instead on speed, ferocity, and the terror of sudden assault. And behind the warriors came the people, the women, the children, the wagons. This was not simply a raid, but a migration. It was an invasion with roots and branches, a movement that sought not plunder alone, but permanence. Balimar's followers intended to settle, to replace Rome's order with their own. Each farm they burned, each villa they seized, was not merely destruction, but conquest. Rome had faced barbarian incursions before, but this was different. Hannibal had once crossed the Alps with elephants, but his army was a spear thrust, a weapon meant to shatter Rome's pride before retreating to Carthage. Balimar's horde was something else, a tide of people who could not simply be defeated in battle and dispersed. Even if beaten, they would regroup, return, and press again, for behind them was hunger, overpopulation, and the relentless pressure of tribes further north. In Balimar's councils, his vision was clear. He told his warriors that Rome was soft, that her cities were rich and undefended, that her gods had abandoned her. He pointed to Aquileia's ashes as proof that Rome could be broken. He reminded them that the empire was stretched thin, its soldiers plagued and weary, its emperor a philosopher who preferred scrolls to spears. Whether true or not, the image of Rome's weakness became a weapon as potent as any blade. The enemy also understood the land. The dense forests and rivers of the Danube frontier were no obstacle to men raised within them. Roman columns, heavy with baggage and bound by roads, struggled to adapt. Balimar's warriors moved like wolves, quick, silent, deadly. They attacked in twilight, vanished into mists, and returned with renewed fury. Every grove became an ambush, every hill a fortress. And yet the Marcomanni were not savages without vision. They admired Rome's wealth, her stone cities, her trade. Many had served as auxiliaries in the legions, learning Roman tactics, discipline, even Latin itself. Balimar used this knowledge well. He knew how the Romans fought, how their generals thought, and he turned that wisdom against them. It was as if Rome faced a reflection of herself, crude but cunning, savage yet sharpened by experience. For Marcus Aurelius, this enemy was unlike any he had ever known. He was not merely fighting to repel raiders, but to stop an entire migration that threatened to uproot Rome's northern provinces. Every victory had to be decisive. Every defeat could be fatal. He was no longer defending borders. He was defending civilization itself. To the Romans who heard of Balimar's victories, the Marcomanni became a specter of apocalypse. Stories spread that entire legions had been annihilated, that barbarian hordes would soon flood the streets of Rome. Refugees swore that they had seen temples desecrated, elders crucified, children dragged away in chains. Whether exaggerated or not, such tales magnified the terror. Thus, the Marcomanni storm was more than an enemy of flesh and blood. It was an enemy of the Roman mind. It preyed upon fear, uncertainty, and despair. And in that sense, Balimar's greatest weapon was not his axe, nor his cunning, but the dread he inspired in the heart of the eternal city. The storm had gathered, the storm had struck, and still it gathered strength. And as Marcus Aurelius sharpened his sword and rallied his men, he knew he faced not only armies of warriors, but the tide of history itself, surging against Rome's ancient walls. The Roman Empire, battered yet unbroken, found itself standing at a precipice. From the forests of Germania came fire and death. From the pestilence came despair, and from the uncertainty of succession came whispers of collapse. The legions were weary, the provinces restless, and the Senate fractured. Yet in the heart of this storm stood one figure, calm, resolute, and unyielding. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, carried upon his shoulders not only the weight of empire, but also the very soul of Rome itself. He was no stranger to suffering. The plague had carried away his co-ruler and brother by adoption, Lucius Verus, leaving Marcus to govern alone. His own children had perished in infancy. Friends, generals, even family had been claimed by fate. Yet instead of allowing grief to hollow him, Marcus transformed sorrow into steel. His philosophy, honed through the meditations he scrawled in tents and on campaign, became more than private musings. They became the bedrock of leadership. For Marcus Aurelius did not guide Rome with empty slogans or divine pretensions. He offered no promise of effortless victory, no illusion that Rome's destiny was guaranteed. Instead, he gave his people something rarer, the discipline to endure. His Stoic creed taught him that fortune was beyond control, but virtue, duty, and courage lay within reach. And so, in a time when the empire threatened to splinter, he became the living embodiment of resilience. In the Senate, he confronted paralysis and division. Some senators urged retreat from the Danube, arguing that Rome's frontiers had grown too vast, its coffers too strained, its armies too thin. Others demanded reckless assaults into the forests, seeking glory at the cost of discipline. Marcus listened patiently, then spoke with a clarity that cut through pride and panic alike. Rome, he reminded them, was not merely a city of stone, nor just an empire of borders. It was an idea, a covenant between its people and its history. To abandon the frontier would invite the barbarians to Italy's gates. To squander lives in rash offensives would bleed Rome white. The path was balance, firm defense, strategic offense, unshakable resolve. On the Danube, he became more than a distant sovereign. He lived as one of the soldiers. The emperor slept beneath canvas, ate coarse bread, and marched through mud and snow alongside his men. When plague hollowed the ranks, Marcus visited the sick. When morale faltered, he walked the camps, speaking to centurions, reminding them that their service was not in vain. His presence transformed despair into loyalty. To fight under Marcus Aurelius was to believe that Rome still had purpose. Yet his leadership was not limited to words and philosophy. Marcus Aurelius forged a grand strategy designed not merely to survive but to reclaim momentum. First, he secured the empire's flanks. He made uneasy peace with eastern kingdoms, ensuring no war would erupt while Rome's strength was needed in the north. Second, he replenished the legions, enlisting even slaves, gladiators, and criminals, transforming desperation into manpower. Third, he reorganized the treasury, selling imperial luxuries, even jewels from the palace, to fund the war. No sacrifice was beneath him if it meant Rome endured. His enemies, the Marcomanni and Quadi, believed Rome weak, broken by disease and fear. Yet under Marcus's vision, the empire learned once more to adapt. New fortresses rose along the Danube, watchtowers crowned the hills, and fleets patrolled the rivers. Rome did not merely defend, it prepared to strike back. Marcus Aurelius envisioned not only repelling the barbarians, but pushing beyond, establishing new provinces that would turn the wild north into Rome's shield. The task was immense, and the risks daunting. Yet Marcus drew strength not from certainty of triumph, but from acceptance of struggle. Each night in his tent, he wrote meditations to himself, reminders of humility, duty, and the brevity of life. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one. These were not words for scrolls, but principles for action. By living his philosophy, Marcus infused the empire with a spirit of endurance. Rome's survival was not guaranteed. Legions still fell in ambush. Villages still burned. Famine and plague still haunted the land. But where once the empire staggered in chaos, now it marched with purpose. For the first time in years, Rome was not merely reacting to disaster, it was shaping its destiny anew. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-king, had become Rome's guiding hand of renewal. Not through divine miracles, nor through personal glory, but through steadfast resolve, sacrifice, and the courage to lead by example. Under his vision, the empire gathered strength, prepared its armies, and steeled its heart for the battles yet to come. The storm was far from over. The Germanic confederations were gathering once more, united under leaders who dreamed of Rome's fall. Yet now the empire no longer trembled. Behind Marcus Aurelius, it marched toward a new dawn, ready to confront the fury of the north with the discipline of 1,000 years. The forests of Germania still loomed dark and impenetrable, their shadows filled with the whispers of war. Rome had endured plague, famine, and invasion, But survival alone was not enough. To live in mere endurance was to invite death tomorrow. Rome needed not only to survive, but to rise again, to strike back with the fury of an empire reborn. Under Marcus Aurelius, the battered empire stirred to life. From the Danube frontier came news of victories, not overwhelming or decisive, but steady, relentless, like the march of time itself. The legions, once hollowed by pestilence, now stood strengthened by new recruits. Discipline, drilled into them by centurions hardened in 1,000 campaigns, returned like fire rekindled from embers. Fortress by fortress, Rome's shield grew unbreakable. Yet Rome's strength was not forged merely in iron and blood. It was forged in the will of its leader. Marcus Aurelius, weary yet unyielding, breathed resilience into his people. His soldiers saw him endure the same bitter cold and meager rations they did. They saw him share their suffering and thus shared his vision. An emperor who lived as one of them transformed obedience into devotion. The Marcomanni and Quadi, sensing Rome's recovery, gathered their forces for a final test. Their warlords united tribes with promises of conquest, urging their warriors to push beyond the Danube and carve kingdoms from Roman soil. The forests filled with the thunder of mustering war bands. If they could not crush Rome now, they never would. The stage was set for a storm that would decide the frontier's fate. Marcus Aurelius answered with resolve. He divided his legions, sending columns deep into enemy lands, burning villages that had once sheltered raiders. Rivers once crossed by barbarian rafts now ran with Roman patrols. Fields sown by Rome's enemies were put to the torch, denying them sustenance. Every thrust of resistance was met with iron discipline. Rome no longer reacted, it dictated. And then came the moment that would pass into legend. On a parched summer day, a Roman column found itself surrounded by a vast barbarian host. Cut off from supplies, parched by the heat, the legionaries despaired. The barbarians jeered, believing victory inevitable. But as the legions braced for death, thunder split the sky. Rain poured upon the exhausted Romans, quenching their thirst. Lightning struck the enemy camp, sowing chaos. Inspired, the Romans surged forward, scattering their foes in a rout. To later generations, it was remembered as the miracle of the rain, a sign, many believed, that the gods themselves had favored Marcus Aurelius. Though Marcus himself attributed the event not to divine whim, but to the natural order, the effect was undeniable. The miracle became symbol and rallying cry. Rome's soldiers, hearts aflame, marched with renewed ferocity. Each battle that followed became less a contest of survival and more a statement. Rome had returned. By the mid-170s, the tide had turned. The Marcomanni, once invaders of Italy itself, now sued for peace. The Quadi bent the knee, their kings forced to appear before Marcus Aurelius in submission. Even the fierce Sarmatians, whose cavalry had terrorized the frontier, found themselves broken by Rome's steel. Where once the empire trembled at collapse, it now stood poised for expansion. Marcus dreamed of annexing these lands, of turning hostile forests into provinces of Rome, of securing the Danube frontier for generations. This was Rome's rebirth, not sudden, not effortless, but earned through endurance, sacrifice, and iron resolve. The empire, scarred though it was, had rediscovered its strength. Its enemies, who once believed Rome fatally weakened, now learned that the old empire still had teeth, sharper than ever. And yet, woven into this triumph, there remained a shadow. Marcus Aurelius, ever the philosopher, knew victory was never permanent. The empire could conquer, fortify, and legislate, but fate spared no one. His meditations during these campaigns reflect both triumph and humility. Do not expect Plato's Republic, but be content if even the smallest step is made forward. The perfection of life is to live each day as though it were your last. The climax of Rome's resurgence was not only military but spiritual. Rome had proven that it could endure the worst, the plague, the famine, the barbarians, and emerge renewed. But Marcus Aurelius had also shown that true leadership lay not in glory or conquest, but in duty. His triumph was not for himself, but for Rome, for its people, and for the generations yet unborn. By the close of the Marcomannic Wars, the empire stood stronger than it had in decades. Though Marcus would never see his vision of permanent provinces beyond the Danube realized, his death in 180 would pass the crown to his son Commodus. The story of his reign carved itself into Rome's memory. He had taken an empire on the brink of collapse and breathed life back into its soul. The rebirth of Rome was not in monuments or parades, but in the renewed faith of its people. The legions once broken now marched with pride. The provinces once fearful now rested under the shield of Rome, and the Senate, once paralyzed, found itself united behind an emperor whose legacy would echo through the centuries. In Marcus Aurelius, Rome found its philosopher-king, one who guided not by illusions of invincibility, but by the truth of endurance. And in its darkest hour, that truth was enough to rekindle the flame of an empire. Thus ended the long storm on the Danube, not with Rome's fall, but with its rebirth. The empire stood, scarred yet unbroken, its destiny forged anew in the crucible of suffering. For as long as men remembered the name of Marcus Aurelius, they would remember not only a warrior but a guide, an emperor who showed that even in the face of despair, Rome could rise again.